And then we see, like at this Phoenix City Council meeting in the film, and we see this all the time when there's public deliberations on what we do, people holding up money and saying, it says in God we trust on it, and that's being held up as though it's an exclusive license for only Christian voices within the public forum. And they're never going to stop with just a Ten Commandments monument or just in God we trust. Soon they're pointing to that iconography on the public grounds to bolster their arguments for abortion restriction, bolster their arguments. The separation of church and state. And I must point out that this question is asked by physicist Ellery Shem, whose landmark Supreme Court battle challenged compulsory Bible readings in the school, and they were found unconstitutional. And when you're in the business I am, we read this precedent over and over again. It's cited. He really set some precedent and laid some groundwork for some of the things we do. I think Ellery Shem deserves a round of applause. So the state of the church and state is better than it would be if people like you weren't doing what you had done previously. But now we're certainly in a dire state of affairs given Trump's many federal judge appointments and the disposition of the Supreme Court, which is going to outlast Trump for a good long time. And I'll never really forgive Obama for just yielding to the Republicans refusing to give him a Supreme Court nomination a full year before his term expired. Just, I guess, banking on a Democratic win the next time around, which, of course, didn't happen to the chagrin of most reasonable people. But I really do think that they are working towards building novel arguments for exclusive Christian privilege in public forums, and we see that the kind of rhetoric they're going to use to do that in decision like the Blandensburg Cross ruling, where they cite again and again history and heritage, claiming these kinds of arguments that Mr. Kevin Cruz was citing in the documentary, that these kinds of Christian symbols are uniquely patriotic and speak uniquely to American tradition and ceremony in ways that I think they'll declare the Satanic Temple need not apply. And that's why it was really important from the start that we built the type of arguments that we did in pointing to American jurisprudence to build our arguments and saying things about the Baphomet Monument paying homage to First Amendment values, or also pointing to events like the witch hunts in the United States, in Salem, and talking about how we gained some of our rights from some of our wrongs, and we built a secular judicial structure based on these kinds of errors of our past, and that we're not glorifying that these things happened, but people should remember our history and our heritage. And I love doing that kind of thing because it makes dickheads like Tucker Carlson explode at the head when I start using that conservative rhetoric to justify what we're doing, and they're just not used to having the tables turned like that.
In the red shirt?
Do you mind talking about, like, so from this, I kind of got the sense that the Church of Satanism is somewhat sorry, I'm playing on word, anti, like, formal hierarchies, and balancing that with the bureaucracy of, like, how do you get that balance?
Yeah, the question is about the balance between autonomy, our anti-authoritarian philosophy, as juxtaposed against the fact that we've had to build kind of a formal structure in which we operate. And I kind of look at it like the American experiment in microcosm, right? Like federalism versus state rights. And it's always going to be a debate and a dialogue, and it will never be resolved, and it never should be. And I think that's a symbol of strength rather than weakness, that we're always debating these things. I don't think any society can legitimately function in absolute lawless anarchy, but you have to run on this principle of maximum autonomy when you decide, when you make these decisions you're making, so you can honor that principle of anti-authoritarianism. And it's not simply being anti-authority, it's anti-arbitrary authority. We always kind of put that caveat down there because there are legitimate authorities, and if you do let things degenerate in anarchy, then, you know, certain regulations are in place to make sure that people aren't exploited by other autocratic entities, or that monopolies don't happen, or that corporations don't start poisoning people nearby without their knowledge or consent. So sometimes giving people the maximum autonomy means regulating how other people behave, and you're never going to have necessarily a perfect balance on that, but you always need to adjudicate that, and it's important to have principles in place and not just picking and choosing based upon arbitrary feelings of viewpoint. And that's kind of what we're fighting the government now on, is trying to give them that basic civics lesson where they can have their open forum, but they need to engage in viewpoint neutrality. And if they're not willing to do that, then they shouldn't have the open forum at all. And I think internally, we understand those principles better than a lot of our elected officials, and that's pretty scary.
Next question. Yes, you.
So I have a question. There's kind of, I see like two sides that a lot of like atheist or like non-secular groups have, of focusing on particular beliefs or actions of religious institutions as bad, or perhaps some others say, you know, the entire religious institution being based on faith is a negative impact on society as a whole. I was kind of curious what the temple's stance was on that. You know, do they just focus on particular actions or beliefs of religions, or do they have more whole-scale opinions on particular religions? And this boils down to, will there ever be a satanic bake sale working with a Unitarian Universalist or anything like that?
Well, one thing the documentary doesn't show about that rally that we did in Arkansas was there were actually a couple Arkansas Christian pastors who spoke before I spoke, and they were speaking in defense of our right to be represented on the public grounds in the open forum. They were Christians, and apparently they have their congregations, but they understood that this was an important issue. They understood the gravity of it, and getting people to understand the gravity of this has been kind of a disappointment to the director, Penny Lane. She feels she didn't do enough to show people that this issue of the Ten Commandments monument on the Arkansas public grounds goes well beyond Arkansas. The film started being made before many of the disclosures about Project Blitz, but that kind of coordinated effort from theocrats was very apparent to us from the start. The wording of the bill of the Oklahoma Ten Commandments Monument Bill was almost exactly the same as the wording of the bill that Jason Rapert endorsed in Arkansas. And they have kind of a code of silence about this. And when Rapert was under deposition with us a couple months ago in Arkansas, we asked questions about the history of the Ten Commandments bill, the revision history, where it came from, that kind of thing. And he claimed legislative immunity from having to answer those questions, which is, of course, we're objecting to the court about, but they're trying to keep this concealed even now that we do know about Project Blitz. But, I mean, to the question of having kind of being able to work with different theistic groups, or you know, the question of theistic beliefs in general, it's an organizational stance that we don't endorse any supernatural beliefs. If people fill in that kind of God of the gaps personally, I think ultimately that has destructive properties. If you can believe in supernatural things, but be flexible enough that when those gaps are filled, you can accept it, maybe not. But even benign things, or things that I took as benign earlier on in my life, like a belief in the soul, I saw having very negative ramifications when it came to questions of reproductive rights. The idea that even the basic cells forming a fetus at the very beginning are having no higher cerebral functions, having no perception, are nonetheless ensouled, are kind of driving these ideas about the sanctity of fetal life. There's a lot of research, I think, that could have been done, that can still be done on stem cells. People kind of forgot about the stem cell issue and using fetal tissue for that. That's been inhibited by these religious beliefs. And as I said previously, I kind of thought, what's the harm in the comfort of believing that after you die, your soul goes somewhere? So personally, I feel that superstitious beliefs are ultimately always going to be harmful. But organizationally, we don't really question that from people unless they're trying to impose it on anybody else. Then they've overstepped.
Sorry, yes.
So with the method of ordainment that's come across, especially with the brand new publication of the TST network, I understand reading upon it, if you wanted to become ordained, there was going to be a course involved. Has there been any date set forth that we'll see any news about this, or is it still in the work process?
Yeah, the question is about ordination and getting our coursework in place. We have a great foundation set. The site that isn't up yet is very well constructed with the coursework. We've just been delaying. It just keeps getting pushed back, the filming dates, because we're filming these lectures to put them online, and that's totally my fault. I keep getting booked up with different things and have different projects come to the foreground. We really wanted it rolled out before the end of this year. It's not going to happen, but after January, I'm going to really block out a segment of the calendar so we can finish the ordination coursework. And I think that will bring the Satanic Temple to a whole different level once we have a legally ordained ministry in place. And it's going to cause for a little bit of restructuring. We're kind of coordinating with the chapters, whether, I assume all the chapter heads will want to be ordained and are working on chapter head structure or an ordained structure thereafter, and how many people are ordained and those kinds of protocols. But we're getting closer and closer as time goes on. Just keep an eye out. We're sending updates regularly too.
Yes.
You mentioned a bit ago, I thought it was really interesting about the risks about having your organization penetrate into Africa, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. And I applaud your judiciousness for doing it. In your estimation, does that kind of relegate you to the more advanced, democratically elected countries? You're not going to have a lot of success in countries where it's a little more either politically unstable or where there's too much religious extremism, because you could pose risks.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, we do prefer that people be at least in a stable territory that we can feel we're not giving our endorsement to them signing their own death warrant before they go into action. And in some places, I'm just not well aware enough of the culture and the political climate, because we'll have people reaching out to us and telling us sometimes that it's really all propaganda or whatever. We can have a chapter in Saudi Arabia, and I think, I don't really know though. And what we're trying to do is have better contact with people in different places in the world. So what we're more likely to do is have advisors or members on council, or people who will regularly communicate with council who are in areas we don't have that kind of background on, to give us kind of updates and let us know what they're doing. And if they have their own kind of community already pre-existing that they meet with and aren't necessarily public about, you know, that's a different thing. But I just want to be sure that we have a solid understanding of what somebody's getting into.
Yes.
Given the type of restrictive abortion laws that are popping up around the country, I've heard you talk about possibly opening up an abortion clinic in Missouri or somewhere else. How's that going?
You know, the kind of tactics shift as we see what's more legally viable, and that's still a potential option. I also just saw an article earlier today seeing that Georgia is funneling millions of dollars into these fraud abortion clinics that are actually set up to dissuade people from having abortions. And, you know, of course, I always look at these types of things and see or try to think of, well, what's the equal access argument here? You know, where how could this bite them in the ass, because they definitely deserve it. You know, we have several different little nefarious things in the works regarding reproductive rights right now, but I don't know that I want to speak about them openly because they kind of require no knowledge on the part of the enemy beforehand, I think. Or at least they benefit greatly from having a surprising press release come out one day. Because one thing that might not have been entirely clear is that sometimes we've jumped headlong into litigation without having anything like the finances to support it. And we just banked on getting the press attention to support the crowdfunding that we would do for it. And we've been very lucky in that regard just to stay afloat at all. In the beginning, we really thought we'd get pro bono support for most anything. At least I did. I naively thought that lawyers would just eat this up and they would love the idea of defending the Satanic Temple because it was new territory, right? This is going to be precedent-setting stuff. And it was amazing to me how many people, you know, would not respond to the call at all.
In front.
Thanks. So after the movie was released, I'm assuming that there was a huge influx of people wanting to be members, joining, contributing, right? How would you say that? So this is a two-part question. One is, how would you say that the organization's changed, and is there anything that surprised you in how it's changed after the movie was released? And then I guess the second part is, I'm assuming because of the influx of people wanting to contribute, what have you had to change and how difficult has that become? Because I think I've noticed it myself, I've followed TS3 for a while, and it just seems like you guys are a little bit overwhelmed, and do you have things in place to fix that, to work with that?
Well, we only have the number of volunteers we have, and we only have a council the size that it is right now. So when it comes to processing the massive amount of requests, that's just going to be slow, and, or at least for right now. So when it comes to people who are really impatient about that, there's not a whole lot we can do for them. But as far as changing the character of the organization, I don't think it's really done that. I haven't heard from, I've heard some complaints from chapters that, I think they have, you would know, is there a word for the people who came to us through Hail Satan? I felt like there was.
Oh, there was, yes. Cold there, I can't remember what it was. Documentary Satanists.
Yeah, something like that, yeah, the documentary. So it's something, there was a term for it because there was an influx of people who had this idea of who we are based upon their interpretation of the documentary. And to be fair, I don't think that the documentary misrepresented us at all, but it's amazing how many different things different people can see from the documentary, and how many times you can get these people coming in and saying oh, you guys, we're just a big prank, right? That kind of thing, and disturbed that that chapters are doing ritual events and that kind of thing. That's very transient, though. Like, people who don't like that, they're just not going to be there very long. So it hasn't been a real impact on the character. It's just been an impact on the quantity of requests.
Are you trying to increase the number of volunteers to just get more people handling all of that, like all the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of level of scrutiny we have for accepting somebody's volunteer help is pretty heavy too. I mean, there's a level of almost paranoia, I think, within the Satanic Temple when it comes to allowing anybody to make decisions or speak for us, because we've had some real bad experiences and we feel we don't have as much flexibility as other groups have. I mean, when we were fighting the battle in Oklahoma for the Baphomet Monument to go up alongside the Ten Commandments Monument, there was a small-scale satanic panic in Oklahoma. You know, Satanists were coming, they were trying to get this monument there. They actually had a credible legal argument, and holy shit, this is going to bring the apocalypse on us. And it was ironic to me that in that time, in the time of like the peak of that moral panic against Satanism, there was some Christian kid in Oklahoma, in his 20s, I guess, and he hacked off his roommate's head on the suspicion that his roommate was a witch or a Satanist or something like that. And according to the reports, he had been watching YouTube videos related to his Christian beliefs before he hacked off his roommate's head. And yet, they said that the chief of police actually said, he actually said that because he wasn't affiliated with any Islamic terrorist groups, that there were no religious implications to the crime that he had committed. He was completely blind to the superstitious outrage that drove him to do it. And I was thinking, what if a card-carrying member of the Satanic Temple got high on meth one night, wigged out, and hacked off somebody's head? We'd never hear the fucking end of it. You know, that would be all we are for the rest of time. So that, I think, kind of explains how we have a small, trusted core of volunteers, and it very slowly grows. But we are growing that base from there. We just want to make sure that people are reliable and they're not necessarily wigging out on meth intermittently.
Second row, that side.
Do you know how many members the Satanic Temple has now? Official members?
I don't really know how many members we have now. I stopped really paying attention. A while ago, I was just stuck on the 100,000 number because that was about where it was. But now I really have no idea. And I try to, and now more and more, I try to stay away from social media. I try to stay away from obsessing over metrics and things like that because it's just kind of a downward spiral, and it kind of eats your day away in ways you never noticed. And for me, at least, it takes, I think by nature I'm very introverted, and I never expected to have a public role. So just even knowing that we have these expansive numbers has taken a kind of psychological toll to the point where I kind of pretend it's not there anymore. You know, it's just, it's something I intentionally relegate to the background.
Over in the back of that.
My question is like, would Satanic Temple would be interested in like campaigning for universal like blasphemy rights? Because like I come from Pakistan, we have crazy blasphemy laws, and people can be accused of. I was a journalist. I was accused of some sort of leave the country. So yeah, that's the question.
I'm sorry, I thought that you're from Pakistan. They have absurd blasphemy laws.
Yeah. It's like universal blasphemy like rights, kind of in your mission or kind of put pressure on certain governments.
Right.
Yeah.
But what's the question? Sorry.
Like religious freedom in other countries. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I can only, like I said, we do our best trying to trying to be in correspondence with people who want to start chapters in other countries and things like that. And we don't want them to get killed, but you know, we really do have our hands full here, making sure we don't regress any further. And I can easily see anti-blasphemy laws rearing their ugly head under some other name here in the U.S., and I think that would be rooted in some kind of bipartisan support for anti-hate speech laws, because that's where you see the left also chiming in and saying we need more robust restrictions against free speech because minority voices are being marginalized. And I mean, that's a legitimate viewpoint, but you have to make sure you've considered any collateral damage from anything that's not narrowly focused enough. And in fact, I wrote an essay talking about these issues where, you know, there's kind of these calls for further censorship against free speech or whatever, based on these ideas that minority voices are being marginalized. And I brought up the idea that sometimes it's not always clear who the minority voice is. You know, I think about the Catholics always claiming that what we do is hate speech against them. And would we be affected if hate speech laws went into place? And would we be able to claim that we're a smaller minority as Satanists than the Catholics? Or would there be an insistence that we are kind of assimilated into a larger secular population? And the same goes for ex-Muslims. Ex-Muslims who are critical of Islam are sometimes accused of Islamophobia, even when they came from the Middle East and grew up in Islamic culture, and they're critical against it. And are they assimilated into larger secular culture, or are they a minority within a minority, right? And we need to discuss these things before we give expansive powers to repress voices to a government institution under Trump, right? So I wrote that essay, and people called me a Nazi for it. So I could see, you know, these kinds of well-intentioned motions resulting in terrible things that nobody anticipated, but they should. Because when they see what we're doing, one thing they should be learning is that if it goes one way, it could go the other way too. And you have to consider how the opposition will use that, right? And that's the dialogue we're in now.
Yes.
So in the film we saw the former Detroit branch, and they seem to be going in a sort of like dangerous direction. And I was wondering if there's like any updates on that since the end of the film. And also you mentioned something called Project Blitz, and I was hoping you could expand on that, although in the name you could probably imagine what.
Oh yeah, right. I mentioned Project Blitz, and I didn't elaborate on that. And sometimes I get caught up in my own kind of media bubble and assume everybody keeps up on the same developments that I do. But there's a research group in Somerville here, Political Research Associates, and they really laid the groundwork of doing some research and finding the organized network of theocrats openly trying for the American coup. I think is not an overly hysterical way to state it. They produce model legislation. They try to put believers in positions of authority, guys like Jason Rapert. Rapert's just a mindless little tool for something like Project Blitz. Like I said, I'm certain Jason Rapert did not come up with the idea of the Ten Commandments bill nor the wording. That was handed to him. It was handed to him from this network engaging in this Project Blitz activity. And when you see these concerted efforts all across the United States all at once, all this anti-abortion legislation of the same nature, fetal heartbeat bills and things like that, all of a sudden popping up at one time, you see this agenda to put in God we trust, make it mandatory to have it prominently displayed in all the public schools. You see, you know, these evangelicals pushing these things forward in their state legislatures. That's Project Blitz. These are Project Blitz activities. And it's also part of their playbook, and they do this to us every time. They claim we're outsiders coming into whatever state we're in, and that these people from Boston have no right, forcing their agenda upon the people of Arkansas, where by God they are true Bible-believing people. And they're trying to conceal the fact that none of this is coming from a grassroots level either. These evangelicals, these theocrats, they are really not the majority. They're a dying system. They're a dying movement. But unfortunately, they've managed in the past several decades to really entrench themselves into the political world and push their agenda. And they've also managed somehow to inure people to it. People are numb to it, and people even to this day seem to feel like it's a rather superfluous battle to fight whether a Ten Commandments monument can be on the public grounds or not. In the 50s, when they were fighting to put "In God We Trust" on the money, even the ACLU didn't object. The idea was that this is ceremonial, this is patriotic. There is no way that people at large could take this as a statement of faith. Who gives a shit? And then we see, like at this Phoenix City Council meeting in the film, and we see this all the time when there's public deliberations on what we do, people holding up money and saying, it says "In God We Trust" on it, and that's being held up as though it's an exclusive license for only Christian voices within the public forum. And they're never going to stop with just a Ten Commandments monument or just "In God We Trust." Soon they're pointing to that iconography on the public grounds to bolster their arguments for abortion restriction, bolster their arguments against having to treat the LGBTQ community with any basic sense of dignity. It just keeps advancing further and further, so we can't really allow it at any level and need to stomp it out wherever it rears its ugly head. It's theocracy no matter which way you cut it. But it's the point about the Detroit chapter. I'll let you breathe for a second. Take that in. But with Detroit, Detroit has still a nascent chapter reforming and kind of coming together. And I don't object to the way the Jex subplot was told in Hail Satan. It's only an hour, 30-minute film, and it would be difficult to expand on anything in that film without unraveling the whole rest of the narrative. But I do feel it's important to know that even though she tried to paint this as a call for liberty against the formalization of an institutional structure of the Satanic Temple, the reality is that people felt that she was acting autocratically herself. She hadn't been in contact or communication with us for some time. She kind of left us and went on hiatus before the National Council was formed. So we had a set of rules in place when all of a sudden she reappeared and started doing things in the media that nobody knew about, which made chapters nervous. It made chapters say they wanted executive ministry to act within the same parameters that they had to, that they couldn't put forward this any type of unilateral message that maybe nobody else agreed with just on a whim. And it was me defending her for the most part because, she had some things in her personal life she needed to take time off for. And I was saying that, we could just bring... And she had done this thing prior to that event where it was called Comrades for Congress, and she was encouraging people to send, I think, used condoms, tampons, or something like that to congressmen who had voted for certain abortion restrictions or whatever. And one of the things our council does and that we do is we determine whether something is legally viable, right? Is this a crime? And if so, do we want to do it? Is it something we can defend against or what? And so chapters themselves were really pissed when she did that because nobody knew it was coming. And so we talked to her, we told her, we have this formal process in place. We just don't want people waking up one day finding out we're declared a criminal organization or that something's radically off message and that, you know, they're a party to something they just didn't agree with. So she agreed to that, but then at the time she did that event, she told nobody that it was taking place, but she called the documentarians that were doing a documentary about the Satanic Temple, and they went there and they filmed it, and it seemed like she was far more interested in pursuing her own public career than actually working with us. So at the time it was an amiable split. I called her up and I said, look, it looks like you're going your direction, and you know, the outrage over my end isn't stopping, so why don't you just do your thing and we'll do ours. And that's the way it went.
We'll just take two more questions, so one from you and Dr. Hafer, that's the last question.
Hey, Lucien. So, American Airlines was recently in the news for removing a passenger after wearing a Hail Satan shirt, which they purchased from the Satanic Temple website. Now, I did have an opportunity to talk to this person, but is the Satanic Temple pursuing litigation against American Airlines?
Okay, right. Let me give people some background here. I had a lot to do last weekend, so I was in no mood when a BuzzFeed article popped up and said that a woman had been asked to either change her shirt or get off of an American Airlines flight for wearing one of the Satanic Temple's own Hail Satan t-shirts. She opted to cover it up, but she was seeking remedy from American Airlines thereafter. They told her essentially go fuck herself, so she went public with what had happened, and it generated a lot of press. So American Airlines just gave some kind of facile apology saying that they don't endorse discrimination of any kind, but they didn't address any questions of how they would address this to make sure it didn't happen in the future, given that they apparently have guidelines that let the staff, whatever you call them, the I don't know, people in the planes, they let them decide whether t-shirts or whatever are offensive, or whether outfits people are wearing are inappropriate or whatever else, and they don't seem to have a real sensible set of guidelines that would let people know what's actually offensive and what's none of their business. But I knew there was going to be a lot of press surrounding this, because this is the kind of story that press really gravitates towards, and it's difficult to get press to cover stories about reproductive rights and things like that. But bullshit things like this, they love it. It's real clickbait. But for the Satanic Temple to be a plaintiff in this would be really difficult. It's more on the passenger herself, and she seems to not be interested. A lawyer came forward right away and wanted to take that one pro bono, you know, but she doesn't seem like she's interested in pursuing the lawsuit. And, you know, the only thing I really kind of took from this whole instance was how the media handled it this time around. And it's nice to see that a large number of people instantly rallied to our support. And, but they did that sometimes in ways that I think was a little backward. You instantly saw people defending us, saying, we're a non-theistic group, we're pro-social, we're not like those Satanists, and all these other things, talking about the good the Satanic Temple has done. And of course, being the spokesperson for the Satanic Temple, I like that people understand what the Satanic Temple is and isn't. But I don't want that to get in the way of people's understanding of their religious rights. You don't have to justify wearing a Hail Satan shirt by letting people know that we do public works and we do public good. You can be wearing it because you're misanthropic and want people to feel like they can fuck off and get away from you. Like, it just doesn't matter. It did not matter if she was a theistic Satanist. It did not matter, really, what beliefs that Hail Satan shirt was rooted in. And you can see me kind of take that position with Tucker Carlson the first time I was on the show. It's on YouTube. You should look it up. And his whole argument, because he was trying to argue that we shouldn't have a display in an open forum, or at least he was trying to imply that by saying that he didn't think we were a real religion, but he also thinks that he's a real free speech defender, so I wanted to hammer on that cognitive dissonance. So I took the position that I just didn't fucking care whether he thought we were legitimate or not, that we had a right to put up the display we put on display. Nobody was required to be a religion to engage in the public forum, whether by Tucker Carlson's definition or by the IRS's definition, which we actually do measure up to and we're tax exempt. It just doesn't matter at all. And I hope that people understand that, and I hope that these justifications people give for the Satanic Temple don't get in the way of that.
Okay, final question.
Yes, getting back to what you were saying about legislation and sort of whoever these shadowy individuals or organizations are that actually come up with the model legislation that they then hand off to people in state legislatures. I'm wondering if you know what the relationship between whatever those shadowy organizations are, and I would like to know more about them, and those organizations that do anti-science legislation. Because the Discovery Institute, for instance, is heavily religious, heavily anti-science, and they do model legislation, say for anti-evolution education laws in various states which are currently on the books. And they do a lot of climate change denial and the like. And in fact, usually the anti-evolution laws now are also anti-climate change education laws. So I'm just wondering if you know what the relationships are between these various different sort of background bodies that come up with this stuff.
Yeah, the question is do we really have a map of like the Project Blitz organization? And it's getting there. A lot of it's being drawn by the different associations we see, different funding we see. Like I said, before we even put a name to Project Blitz, I mean, we didn't put the name to it, but before anybody did, we could see that the Ten Commandments legislation was coming from the same place because it was the same wording, same legal arguments, same precedent was being cited erroneously. So that's a real indication that it's coming from the same source as well. But there's some researchers who are doing really good work putting this all together, and some of them I'm in contact with. There's a book called Shadow Network that just came out recently that talks about this evangelical movement to essentially overthrow liberal democracy. And there's a book coming out, I believe, in February by Catherine Stewart, who's a friend of mine. She also was the person who first rolled out the media about our after-school Satan clubs, because that was constructed based on the model put forward by evangelicals who were putting good news clubs into schools across the United States in every school district that they could get it in, that proselytized to kids, inundate them with this kind of authoritarian conditioning. And they get a lot of kids from perhaps secular homes into these because it's used as daycare, right? Some of these school districts we found, they have a shortened school day, one day a week, and that gap will be filled by a good news club. So some kids, whose parents might not be inclined to have them pummeled with religious indoctrination, have their kids in there. Anyway, so I would recommend her book. I was able to read an advanced copy of it, and it's called The Power Worshippers, and it goes a good way into creating that map. But one thing we do know for sure is that we're, on an organizational level, we are grossly outfinanced, we are grossly outnumbered, and we are grossly underrepresented in the political world. But in the rest of the world, I feel like the reasonable voices really are the majority. And amongst Christians, there's certainly no consensus. Getting back to that point earlier about how we had Christians speaking before I spoke at the rally, there are Christians who are offended by the state trying to co-opt their voice as a way to pander to voters. There's a lot more people, I hope, waking up to the problem, and a lot more people willing to indict religious nationalism as they see a lot of the problems that we're facing right now. And I hope people continue to wake up to that, and it's vital that they do.
Thank you very much. And also, by the way, Dr. Abby Hafer, who asked the last question, was one of our speakers over for Darwin Day. And I'd like to ask for a round of applause to her because she has been pushing, like campaigning for legislation at Massachusetts State House, at the Massachusetts Legislature for restricting science instruction in schools to only peer-reviewed, age-appropriate science education, scientific facts. And hopefully this will serve as model legislation. So thank you, Dr. Hafer. And once again, thank you, Lucien.